This video is the basics of the urinary system. The functions of the urinary system include maintaining blood homeostasis, ridding the body of nitrogenous wastes, toxins, drugs, ions that are in excess, producing renin to maintain blood pressure, conserving vitamin D, conversion of vitamin D, and what's interesting is that most people say, oh yeah, the urinary system, the function is to pee. Well, yeah, but what is the reason for this? And the main function is to maintain blood homeostasis, to maintain the concentration, the electrolytes, is to keep the blood happy. This is done through the urinary system. The main overview, the main parts of the urinary system include the kidneys, the ureters, urinary bladder, urinary bladder, and finally the urethra. So the kidneys, the ureters, urinary bladder, and finally the urethra. Those are the main parts. We're going to zoom in into the kidney and look at what's occurring in the kidney. This is going to be most of what we're going to talk about right now. And if we take a look at one kidney in particular, and we zoom in, we find that there are some regions. We got some regions here. We have this outer layer, we have an inner layer, so you can divide the kidney into two parts, two regions. This is called the renal cortex, and all of this colored that you see in here is called the renal medulla. So we have the renal cortex, and in here we have the renal, maybe I'll write it over here, the renal medulla. And that's the renal medulla is all the, and those two terms, the cortex and the medulla, are general anatomical terms that can be used for lots of organs. The outer shell and the inner area, cortex and medulla. And so since we're talking about the urinary system, we call it the renal cortex, which is this area here, and then the medulla. Continuing on, we have these, they look like little triangles. Well, these are actually called renal pyramids. These are the renal pyramids. Right here. These red-green triangles. The orange that you see, these are called the renal columns. The renal columns. And you find those in between the red. So we have a renal pyramid, a renal column, a renal pyramid, a renal column, a renal pyramid, a renal column. Now, the fluid that is produced by the kidneys that eventually becomes urine is made inside of these pyramids. And when they produce it, they exit the pyramid and enter these first initial areas. that you see here in these little where these little X's are. And these are called minor calyces. And the singular form is called a calyx. So this here is an example of one minor, the area, this little white region that you see here, a minor calyx, a minor calyx, a minor calyx. And these minor calyces, as you see, they merge and form a little bit larger areas right here. You see how these merge together and they form little larger areas. So we'll have several of these major calyces. So the renal pyramids produce this fluid into these minor calyces, and then they merge into major calyces, and then even further, then the major calyces will merge and dump into this general area here called the renal pelvis. Students often get renal pelvis and renal hilum confused. The hilum or the hilus is this general region, this whole thing, this indentation of the kidney. We see we have a convex area and a concave sort of area here, and so the whole region is called a hilus or a hilum. But the tube, this area this area that eventually leads to the ureter is called the renal pelvis. So just where the tube is, where the fluid continues to merge. That's called the renal pelvis. And then finally, as we exit the kidney, this is one ureter. Okay. Sorry. Now we're going to zoom in even further, and we're going to look at what occurs right here. So, the functional unit of the kidney, we have millions of these now, is called a nephron, one nephron. And the nephron is the structural and functional unit of the kidney, what we see here in green. In other words, what occurs in the kidney everything that occurs in the kidney occurs in one single nephron. A basic unit, a basic piece, just like a cell. A cell is the building block, is the structural unit of the body. Everything that occurs in the body also occurs inside of the cell. The same thing for the kidneys. We have these structural units, these functional units called nephrons. And there are each of our kidneys contains over 1 million of these nephrons. This is where the urine is actually produced. This is what allows nutrients to go back and forth, inside, outside, to make sure that the blood has an absolute perfect amounts, perfect concentration of all the different factors inside of the blood. we're talking amino acids, we're talking glucose, we're talking electrolytes, potassium, sodium, and so on. And and there are, it's important to note that there are a couple different, there's two different types of nephrons. We have the cortical nephron and we have the juxtamedullary nephron. So if we look at this diagram here, up here we're in the cortex. Down here we're in the medulla. This whole thing is like a we're taking it right out of, you see here's a pyramid right here, and here's the cortex, and the pyramid is inside of the renal medulla. Here's one pyramid. So we're just taking a little snippet out of the cortex and the medulla, the piece of the pyramid here, zoom it in, and we find we have two different types of nephrons. We have the cortical nephron, because the whole thing is in the cortex, and then we have the juxtamedullary nephron right here, because some of it is in the cortex, but some of it, this loop, the loop part of the nephron, actually dips all the way down into the medulla, into where the pyramid is. So, but in general, when we speak about, when we go through all the different regions and the parts and the functions of the nephron, we're just gonna talk about the nephron in general, since both in general do the same, have the same functions. There are some minor differences, but in general everything's going to be the same. So when we take a look at this nephron, we find that it has three parts, three general parts. There's first the renal corpuscle, the proximal convoluted tubule, or the PCT, the nephron loop, which has two parts, the descending and the ascending, and the distal convoluted tubule, or the DCT, and then finally the collecting duct. Let's take a look here one more time. We have the renal corpuscle right here, and the renal corpuscle is made out of a couple things. The capsule, this cap right here, this glomerular capsule, and then the capillaries inside, which is called the glomerulus. So you have the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule that makes up what we call the renal corpuscle. That's part one. That's the first step, the renal corpuscle. That's where most of the blood enters, the fluid enters, the filtrate enters. Then we have this proximal convoluted tubule. That's the second piece of the nephron. The third is the nephron loop. It goes all the way down and all the way back up. So we can cut this into two parts. We have the descending limb of the nephron loop and the ascending limb of the nephron loop. Fourth, we have the distal convoluted tubule. And finally, we have the collecting duct. This collecting duct eventually leads into the minor calyx, and then the major calyx, and then the pelvis, and then the ureter. Okay, now it's up to you to know what is occurring in each of these steps. What is occurring? What is occurring and why? And how does that contribute to maintaining blood homeostasis? When fluid enters, it enters first through blood vessels. This one here is this one here is called the afferent vessel. Afferent. That's the afferent. It's going towards the nephron. Afferent meaning going towards. And how I always like to remember afferent from efferent, meaning going away, is that A sort of looks like an arrow pointing up or towards the nephron. So afferent arterial is going towards, and efferent arterial is going away. E and A. Our blood that is coming from the heart is going into the kidneys, eventually into the nephron. The blood, this arterial enters the renal corpuscle into this region, this little region, if you remember, of capillaries called the glomerulus. And actually didn't draw this totally correctly. This going in is actually a little bit thinner than this coming out. This is actually, this is thicker and this is thinner. And what that does is it causes pressure. This is thicker here. There's more blood coming in, and there's less blood coming out. And that causes pressure right here. And it forces some blood to filter through. This occurs through the process called filtration. Filtration. Filtration occurs at the renal corpuscle. What stuff gets through and what stuff doesn't filter through? You have to know what ends up here and what ends up inside our renal tubule. Well, it's the big stuff that doesn't get through. The little stuff gets through, the big stuff doesn't get through. What's large? Well, we have stuff like red blood cells. Those are very, very large. White blood cells. Proteins. These are three large constituents of the blood that are too large to filter through. In other words, what we find over here and going through that didn't make it into our renal tubule are the things that are too large. Proteins are very large. Red blood cells, white blood cells. However, there's a whole bunch of stuff that does get through, and these are the things that we find inside the blood that are very, very small. For example, we have electrolytes. We're talking sodium, potassium, bicarbonate, magnesium, phosphate, and so on. Water is a big one. Glucose, amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. If the building blocks are the building blocks, they're the smaller pieces that make up the larger. So the amino acids are small enough to get through, just like electrolytes like sodium and potassium. Water, of course, can get, water is very tiny. Water can get through. So it's important to remember what filters through and what doesn't get through. We also have wastes that get through. We have uric acid, urea, lactate, creatinine, some drugs. So all these different things, as long as they're small enough, they will filter through and enter the renal tubule. That's this green. If anything, in general, if anything enters the renal tubule and doesn't come out, it's going to be excreted out of the body. If it exits like this, it'll go into this peritubular fluid, and eventually it'll go back into the blood. Think of the blood as you, because it's going to go back to the body, back to your body. If it goes this direction, then it will be excreted. So we have a couple more terms to be aware of. If it goes into the blood, we call that absorption. We call that absorption. If it exits the tube, it's called absorption. If it enters the blood, it's called absorption. We're reabsorbing. If it exits the blood or enters the tube, it's called secretion. And a lot of these diagrams, we look at just the tube, and so we see a lot of arrows going into the tube, a lot of arrows, and so we think, oh, this is we're absorbing, it's going in, we're absorbing. No, that's actually the opposite. If it goes into the tube, we're secreting. Why? Because if it stays in the tube all the way through, we're going to urinate it out. It's going to be excreted out of the body. So if it goes into the tube, don't get confused. Don't get them mixed up. Into the tube means excreted. Out of the tube means absorbed, because it's going to go out of the tube into the peritubular fluid and eventually back into our blood. And that will go right back to the main bloodstream. So I hope you keep those two terms straight. Absorption, secretion, and which direction are we talking about? Okay, next we have to understand what goes in and out at each of these different parts. Do you remember the 5 parts? We have the renal corpuscle. That's right here. We have the proximal convoluted tubule, which is right here. Convoluted means sort of, it goes in and out, there's lots of folds, it's not straight. That means convoluted. And that's right here. That's the PCT. We have the nephron loop, and remember, we have the descending nephron loop, and we also have the ascending nephron loop. So there's 2 parts of the nephron loop. That's the nephron loop. And then fourth, we have the DCT, which is the distal convoluted tubule. And then finally, we have the collecting duct. So now it's up to you to know what these different parts are, the order of these parts, and then what is the function, what is occurring at each of these parts. So let's start, and we can just write them down on the side here. At the renal corpuscle, we have this special term called filtration. Do you remember what we talked about just a second ago about what enters the tube and what doesn't enter the tube and how? So we have this blood vessel. It's called the afferent arteriole, and it's thicker, it's larger. Therefore, there's more blood coming in, and because the efferent leaving the renal corpuscle is a thinner tube, a skinnier tube, it causes lots of backup, which causes pressure, and that pressure allows for this filtration. It causes stuff to exit the blood. What stays inside the blood? The stuff that's too large. Proteins, red blood cells, white blood cells are too large. But then we have things that are small enough. You have to know. We're talking electrolytes like sodium and potassium and bicarbonate, hydrogen. We're talking the building blocks of the large proteins, amino acids. Water is a big factor. Glucose. We have drugs. We have the nitrogenous waste like creatinine, uric acid, urea. And these are the things that enter the tube. And specifically, the second piece, which is the first and second piece, we have the renal corpuscle and into the proximal convoluted tubule. Once it enters, we call that filtrate. We call that filtrate. The fluid, we call that filtrate. Okay, now, what occurs, this is what occurs specifically at the renal corpuscle. All these things that we talked about, these things that enter and exit, that's at the renal corpuscle. This occurs at the renal corpuscle. At the proximal convoluted tubule, some stuff goes in, some stuff exits. Some stuff is absorbed, some stuff is secreted. And it's up to you to know which stuff is secreted and which stuff is absorbed. 60% of the water that we just put into the tubule exits. What's the term? If it exits the tube, what's the term? Is it absorption or is it secretion? The answer is absorption, because it's going to do this and then it's going to do this. Water is a big factor. It's very strange. You might find it strange that we take stuff out of the blood into the tube and then we're going to exit right back out of the tube. This is how the body regulates blood homeostasis. So we have water that exits, that is reabsorbed. You can say absorbed or reabsorbed. It's really the same thing. We have sodium and potassium that is reabsorbed. And we have amino acids. Glucose also is reabsorbed. Glucose is small enough so it gets through, but it's very important to remember that glucose, all of glucose, it should be everything, gets reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. We should have no sugar that we urinate. When we urinate and we take a blood test, a urine test, there should be no glucose found in the blood whatsoever. No sugar. And if there is, then there is some kind of problem. We're either consuming sugar in excess or we have some sort of diabetic problem. It's the body's last way of getting rid of all that sugar that we consume. So that's what occurs in the PCT. Now we have the nephron loop, and it's important to split this into two parts because the descending has a very specific function and the ascending has a very specific function. Water is absorbed. Water is absorbed.
I'm just gonna bother you.
Water is absorbed in the descending limb. Water is absorbed in the descending limb. Sodium and chloride is absorbed in the ascending limb. That's it. There is nothing else. There actually might be a couple other things, but these are the two main things. Water is absorbed in the descending limb, and sodium and chloride is absorbed or reabsorbed in the ascending limb. Why is that important? Well, the concentration of the blood is 300. This is milliosmoles per liter. This is the osmotic concentration of the blood. And in the PCT, it's also 300 milliosmoles per liter. However, what we find out is that this number begins to increase. 300, 400, 500, all the way down, all the way up to 1200 milliosmoles per liter. Why is that? Oh, sorry. Why is that important, or what is occurring? The concentration of the renal tubule is going up. It's going from 300 to 4 to 5 to 6 to 7, all up to 1200. How is the concentration going up? Either we're dumping solute inside, or we're taking water out, and therefore the concentration goes up. And the answer is, well, water is coming out. We're reabsorbing it into the bloodstream, and therefore the solute is going up. Then what happens? It goes back down, 1200, then 800, and 400, and so on. It goes back down. How does it go back down? Well, it's one of two things. Either we're taking sodium and chloride out, or we're dumping water in order to dilute it. And the answer is, well, we're getting rid of the sodium chloride out of the tube. We're absorbing it into the bloodstream. So it's important to realize that the concentration goes up and then back down, because water is being reabsorbed out of the tube and into the bloodstream, and sodium chloride is being secreted out of and because sodium chloride is also being absorbed here out of the tube and into the bloodstream. Absorbed, and sodium chloride is being reabsorbed as well. So the concentration is 300, just like in the bloodstream. 300, then it goes up, then it goes back down. This is the body's way of regulating the concentration of our blood. Regulates all the different things. This is a very, very long tube, times a million, millions and millions of these per kidney, and we have 2 kidneys. So we now know what occurs in the renal corpuscle. We know what occurs in the PCT. We know what occurs in the descending limb of the nephron loop, the ascending limb of the nephron loop. Now we have two parts left. What occurs in the DCT and what occurs in the collecting duct? Well, we have sort of some minor movements. We have some potassium here in hydrogen. This is sort of we're done. Most of the stuff that occurs, it's occurring here. But we have sort of some minor things. We have some leftover stuff. Some extra water reabsorption if we need. If we need some extra water reabsorption, we need, and bicarbonate. And sodium and chloride. But this is, it's definitely residual. It's not, we're talking minor here, not major. The major water reabsorption and the major sodium chloride reabsorption occurs right here and here. And also in the PCT, we have lots and lots of things. It seems like most of the stuff that gets that exits the blood and into the tube gets reabsorbed right away, right in the PCT. Finally, in the collecting duct, we have some some minor. This is our last chance for water reabsorption in the collecting duct. Last chance. So it's important to remember that that most of the movement occurs in the PCT and the nephron loop. In the DCT and the collecting duct, we have this. There's a couple of words that we use. We use obligatory water reabsorption, meaning it's going to occur no matter what. Obligatory, like obligation, it's going to occur no matter what. And then we have this facultative, which is the facultative, which is in the DCT and the collecting duct, which is if the body needs extra water or if the body has extra water, we can have this is what occurs here varies. This always occurs. This here varies depending on if we are overhydrated or if we are dehydrated. So we're almost done here. There's just a couple more things to understand. We have in the brain, in the pituitary gland, we have this hormone called antidiuretic hormone. And the antidiuretic hormone acts on the DCT and maybe even more so on the collecting duct. Antidiuretic hormone. Anti meaning to stop, diuretic meaning to urinate, hormone. This hormone allows us to retain that extra water that would normally be that could just stay in the DCT and the collecting duct. ADH allows us works on the DCT and collecting duct to absorb extra water and H2O. Water and in the DCT and collecting duct. This is called ADH. And caffeine also works on the DCT as well. Alcohol blocks ADH. Alcohol blocks the production of ADH. Alcohol blocks ADH. If alcohol stops us from retaining water, remember ADH this is normally made, right, in the body. Antidiuretic, to retain, to keep us hydrated. If alcohol blocks this hormone, then we don't have a way to reabsorb that extra last 15% of water. In other words, it won't be reabsorbed. It'll stay in the tube and it will be urinated out. That is how alcohol dehydrates us. Caffeine works in the same way, except not with ADH, but it acts on sodium and chloride. It prevents normal reabsorption of sodium and chloride like we have here. But it's again acting on the DCT. Caffeine acts on the DCT as well. And if we don't get that extra sodium and chloride, remember, wherever sodium and chloride goes, water generally follows. And if we don't reabsorb sodium and chloride, we don't reabsorb water, and therefore caffeine is another diuretic. Both alcohol and caffeine work somewhat in the same way, and these are diuretics. We find caffeine in coffee, in tea, in chocolate, but it's in higher concentrations in coffee, which is why we know that why we always talk about caffeine being dehydrates us, being a diuretic. Alcohol blocks ADH. Caffeine prevents the reabsorption of sodium and chloride. So, there's just one more thing that I want you to take note of. Notice the path of our bloodstream. We have here, we definitely have interaction with the tube and our blood right here at the renal corpuscle, made of this glomerular capsule and the glomerulus, these capillaries. But then we see here that the movement of urea, the movement of fluid is going this way. However, our blood is actually moving this way. There's a counter current. So, at this point right here, we have sodium and chloride being absorbed and entering. What do you think is going to happen to the concentration of our blood? It's going to be very, very high. A very high concentration. There's a ton of sodium and chloride. There's a ton of salt. And because there's a ton of salt right at this point, by the time we get over here, that's why we have very high amount of water reabsorption, because we have a very high concentration of salt inside the blood. So that's why we have water reabsorption here. It's because we have a high concentration of salt. So water naturally goes right in. That's the reason why it's pulled at this point. So now we know what occurs, and we know why it occurs here at the descending limb of the nephron loop. So just to review what the movement of ions and nutrients in the nephron loop. Whatever stays inside the tube gets excreted. If it moves into the tube, it's called secretion. If it moves out of the tube, it's called absorption. Why? Because it's going to move out and into the bloodstream. We have a very long tube, and this ensures the proper concentration at the end of our blood. So that way, all the different constituents, everything that makes up the blood inside the blood, all of our electrolytes, our amino acids, water, glucose, and so on, guarantees proper concentrations of everything, and pressure, and so on, osmotic pressure. And so when we talk about the kidneys, it's actually the nephron that allows for all this physiology. And then don't forget how the concentration increases because water is exiting the tube, is being reabsorbed, and then the concentration decreases because sodium and chloride is now being reabsorbed into the bloodstream. And it's finally at the DCT and collecting duct where we have the last chance, that last 15% chance of water reabsorption. ADH helps with that. Antidiuretic hormone. It acts to allow that extra reabsorption. However, if we consume alcohol, that will block ADH and not allow that reabsorption. The water will then stay in the tube and it will be urinated out. Caffeine works the same way. It prevents the reabsorption of sodium, and therefore it will stay in and be excreted out. That concludes the overview, the basics, the principles of the urinary system. Thank you.